Okay, so I stopped last video talking about municipal bonds and the fact that they are taxed at the state level usually, although not always, but usually the state level or local level. They're not taxed at the federal level. So we have to run a little bit different calculation to figure out what the return on them is. So notice that, if you can read this table correctly, my tax exempt yield, this is my marginal tax rate over here, and this is the yield. This is the yield that it's giving me, period, kind of my flat yield, so what the bond is stated at. And this is what the actual calculation of the yield is because of the tax savings. So I created another table myself, kind of show a few more percentages about what the yield is. So if I've got to clarify this, if I've got a bond that returns me 1%, but it's a municipal bond where taxes it's exempt from tax, and the tax rate that it's exempt from is 10%, then the true yield on that bond is 1.11, or one of the ones from the table here. It's the first one on the table. If I've got a 5% yield bond at a 20% tax rate, then 6.25% is the actual yield of that bond. I put this in more real numbers. I put that down. I showed down here kind of what it looks like. So if I have a par value of $10,000 and interest rate of 5%, so I'm using this line here, interest rate of 5%, my tax exempt yield would be $500. But if I were to be taxed on that at a rate of 20%, I would only get $400. So effectively, I'm looking at the difference between those two and showing that now my yield is actually 6.25% because of the fact that I'm basically saving. I'm including the tax savings in my calculation for the yield of that particular bond is what I'm doing. Okay, this is just a ratio of yields to municipal bonds to corporate BAA rated debt. BAA is just one of the methods we use to give credit scores to companies. So that's a level of credit score. You know, for individuals, it's usually a number, but for organizations, for corporations, it's in letters. Whereas like AAA, triple capital letter A is the highest one, and then it goes down from there. It depends on what rating service you're using there too. All right, corporate bonds. Corporate bonds are when private firms can directly borrow money effectively from individuals. It's rather than having to go to banks or rather than having to take out notes or loans, they can issue bonds instead. There's different grades of bonds, and it really goes, there's more than just two. They only talk about two different ones here. They kind of split them in half, but really there's a lot of grades on bonds. They talk about investment grade versus speculative grade. Investment grade has a lower risk of default, but does not, so basically you're talking about companies with higher credit scores. So it has a lower risk of default, which means there's lower risk, which means that it usually returns less, whereas speculative grade usually are lower credit score companies that could have a higher potential of default, which increases your risk. So it generally also has a higher interest rate or rate of interest for return. Mortgage-backed securities, backed by a pool of mortgages with pass-throughs for monthly payments to cover defaults. Collateral, traditionally all mortgages conform since 2006 to a subprime alternative. A subprime mortgage are included in these pools. Private banks purchased and sold pools of subprime mortgages. This is one of the major causes of the market crash of the recession that we had in 2008 because we had a lot of subprime lending. And subprime lending, to just make sure we know understand what that is effectively lending money to people that couldn't afford, or best way to say it is they were giving out loans at very high interest rates to individuals that lacked the ability to pay. So they eased up credit to the point where a ton of people were defaulting on loans. Banks were giving out loans to people that, you know, could get nowhere near affording what the actual loan was and what the payment was. Effectively, a lot of them just counted on repossessing the collateralization of that loan, be it a home, a car, or otherwise, and reselling it and gaining a little bit on the difference. You know, they made a few payments, but that's all they can make, or they made a payment for a couple of years, but that's all they could make. And another driver of this was the fact that housing prices were going up substantially. So if I sold a house for, you know, $200,000 and they paid on it for 2 years and they defaulted and I got it back, you know, in a good market, and that at that time, it wouldn't be abnormal for a 2 or 3 years period for that to have gone up to a $260,000, $70,000 house, and depending on the area of the country and things. So they're getting a $200,000 asset back, but now the values of it is $260,000 or $270,000, and then they're reselling it. So they're also making money on the gain for the rapid rise in housing prices at the time. So this shows how private-backed securities and how the private issuers skyrocketed before the recession. This is what caused the problem. And the other thing that's not broken down here, but a good portion of these, if they had another bar set here, a good portion of these were subprime lending from the private sector. And then you see that obviously backed off quite a bit after the recession when they figured out that really wasn't a good idea. And you can just see how their piece of the pie expanded until everything kind of fell through. Asset-backed securities, different loans. So effectively what we're talking about here, what we're showing here is that a lot of different types of loans are put into pools for asset-backed securities. And there's some that are secured and collateralized, things like automobiles and mortgages and equipment. But then there are other elements, and they're basically mitigating risk on the riskier ones, things like student loans and credit cards that they don't really have collateral for. They can't really collect. They can't collect your education, or they can't collect the items on the credit card usually. So they're mitigating their risk by using asset-backed securities and pooling them with less secure or non-collateralized securities, debt securities. Okay, and this is just the fixed income market and different values in billions. This is from 2017. I'd have been really interested to see this. I didn't go find one, but it'd be interesting to see this in 2005, 6, 7, right before the crisis happened. I would warrant to think that probably this other asset back here would be expanded, and the mortgage related would probably also be expanded. I think these two pieces of the pie would be much larger pre-recession 2008 or so. Okay, depository receipts. American depository receipts, also called American depository shares, are certificates traded in the U.S. that represent ownership in foreign securities. So effectively, it's just a method that we use to buy equity or buy stock in companies that are not on the U.S. trade. Okay, so they're not part of the U.S. trade. And then we will start talking about equity securities in the next video.